What could be more dangerous, life in a cage or freedom that could kill you? 3 teenagers from a tiny Pacific island decided to answer this question, unaware that they would pay the ultimate price for their answer. The South Pacific Ocean does not tolerate recklessness. This vast watery desert, the size of a dozen Saharas, is considered one of the most dangerous bodies of water in the world, a place where there is nothing but endless blue for hundreds of miles around. Lost in this blue silence, the rare islands seem like fragile oases of life, tiny dots in an ocean that could easily wipe out any trace of human presence. Tokelau is a tiny country made up of 3 coral islands in a ring shape. Such islands are called atolls, narrow strips of land in the shape of a ring or horseshoe that surround a lagoon. They were formed on the site of ancient volcanoes that gradually sank beneath the water, leaving only coral reefs above the surface. A total of about 1,500 people live on Tokelau's 3 islands. The northernmost of these islands, Atafu, is a patch of land covering only 1.4 square miles, home to 524 people. There is no airport, roads, dogs, or prisons here. Life on this tiny atoll flows steadily and predictably. The traditional diet consists of coconuts and fish, and the nearest significant landmass, Samoa, is a 28-hour ferry ride away. From anywhere on the coast of Atafu, all you can see is the ocean stretching to the horizon, all-consuming, alluring, and deadly. For the locals, the sea is both a source of sustenance and a potential killer. Experienced fishermen who have earned the title of tautai from the elders know its capricious nature and rarely stray far from shore. But for young people who have grown up on a tiny island where every day is the same as the last, this endless expanse sometimes becomes a symbol of unattainable freedom and adventure. For most 15-year-olds, life is full of possibilities and discoveries. But for Samu Peles and Philo, as well as their 14-year-old friend Itweni Nassau, the world was limited to the narrow shores of their native atoll. Born into a community where everyone knew each other from birth, they grew up amid centuries-old traditions and a simple way of life, where the elders and experienced fishermen were the main authorities. Samo, a stocky teenager with a determined look, always showed leadership qualities. He was not afraid to take risks and often initiated various activities. His cousin Philo stood out among his peers for his deep faith, inherited from his family. Meanwhile, Itweni, the youngest of the 3, was indecisive and prone to succumbing to the influence of his more assertive relatives. Like many teenagers around the world, they dreamed of more than life on Atapu could offer them. Watching the adults go out to sea day after day to fish, return with their catch, gather coconuts, and spend their evenings talking, the young men felt an irresistible longing for adventure. Philo often said that Atapu was like a prison, where the walls were the endless ocean, and the keys to freedom were held by everyone but them. The evening of October 5, 2010, began like hundreds of others on Atapu, but for 3 teenagers, it was to be the beginning of an adventure that would change their lives forever. That evening, they found themselves with a bottle of vodka, a rarity on the atoll, where alcohol is delivered infrequently and is highly prized. Under the cover of gathering twilight, when most of the inhabitants were preparing for bed, Samu, Philo, and Itweni discussed their future. "Imagine what it would be like to see something other than this island," Samu said thoughtfully, passing the bottle to Philo. As the alcohol level in the bottle decreased, a daring plan began to form in the teenagers' minds. "I know where my uncle's boat keys are," Samu said suddenly. A dangerous gleam appeared in his eyes. Philo supported the idea, and Itweni, though hesitant, agreed to follow his friends. The 3 of them began to spontaneously prepare for departure, without even thinking about the consequences. None of them had the title of master fisherman, which, according to Tokelau law, meant they were prohibited from going out to sea on their own. But this night was their night, and the rules seemed distant and insignificant. They split up around the village, gathering supplies for the trip. Sama obtained the keys to his uncle's 14-foot aluminum boat, a simple vessel with a 15-horsepower Yamaha engine, wooden benches, and low sides only 16 inches above the water. Together, they stole several cans of gasoline, about 20 gallons. Philo returned with a green tarp, 20 coconuts, 2 bottles of milk, a small can of water, and a ceramic cup. He also grabbed a pack of cigarettes and another sealed bottle of vodka. Sam added a few more coconuts to the supplies. Surprisingly, no one even thought to take any fishing gear. After loading their modest belongings into the boat, the teenagers drank more vodka for courage. Then Samu started the engine. This was the last moment when they could change their minds and return to their beds, resetting the counter of their former lives. Etueni froze in indecision, intuitively sensing the danger of their venture. Doubt flashed across his face, but a rush of adrenaline and youthful rebellion overwhelmed him. In an instant, the boat was passing through the reef surrounding Atafu, accompanied by the cheers of the 3 teenagers. For the first time in their lives, they found themselves on the ocean side of the atoll without an experienced mentor. Their plan was simple and naive: to reach the neighboring atoll in 3 or 4 days. In reality, they had no navigational instruments, no experience in long-distance sailing, and not even a clear idea of which direction to head in. They spent the first night in a state of excitement, continuing to drink vodka and discussing their courage. Philo was the first to tire and curled up at the bottom of the boat. Samu was steering the engine, while Etueni, in a drunken state, somehow managed to take off his shirt and lose it overboard. Gradually, fatigue took its toll, and Samu also felt sleepy. Etueni took over the controls, but soon turned off the engine, and all 3 fell asleep on the metal bottom of the boat. When Etueni woke up first to the sound of seagulls circling above them, he was alarmed to discover that land was no longer visible. The bright sunlight made it impossible to follow the star they had chosen the night before. Philo soon woke up and immediately leaned over the side of the boat in a fit of nausea. Then Samu woke up and also fell victim to seasickness. They began to open coconuts, smashing them against the side of the boat, drinking the liquid and throwing away the shells, without even bothering to scrape out the nutritious flesh. Then they drank the milk and smoked a few dry cigarettes. They started the engine periodically, but without any aim or direction. Their new idea was to follow the seagulls, believing that the birds would naturally return to land. But the birds seemed to be flying randomly, perhaps in large circles. As the day drew to a close, the teenagers began to feel a little hungry and wondered what people were saying about them back home in Atafu. On the second day of their drift, they saw a plane flying low. They decided it was a search plane, and Etueni began waving his arms. But Samu and Philo immediately began teasing him for wanting to be rescued so soon. The teenagers believed that 2 days was not enough time to look heroic. They were sure that the plane would return later. Their naivety and youthful heroism at that moment proved to be their fatal mistake. Meanwhile, the alarm had already been raised on Atafu. A meeting of residents was called to discuss the boy's disappearance. The prevailing feeling was, "Oh no, not again." The island had not yet recovered from the tragedy 8 months earlier, when 3 people on a barge were caught in a storm. Their boat capsized, and their bodies were washed ashore. And now 3 more were missing. The forecast promised stormy weather. Help was requested from the Royal New Zealand Air Force, which quickly dispatched a military patrol plane, an Orion, equipped with radar capable of detecting even a small submarine. The total search area covered more than 8,500 square miles. The plane searched 3 times, returning to Samoa to refuel for a total of 8 hours, but to no avail. By the 3rd night, with no idea where they were, minimal supplies, and a frightening uncertainty ahead, the 3 teenagers were still not panicking. They were confident that someone would rescue them soon. They did not know that their story was just beginning, and that the next few days, or even weeks, would be a test that could break even the most courageous people. On the 4th day of drifting, reality began to seep through their youthful optimism. The teenagers finished the last coconuts, carefully scraping out the flesh that they had previously thrown away without a second thought. The water in the mayonnaise jar had run out yesterday. Sama, Philo, and Etwini finished the milk and smoked all their cigarettes. By evening, they had used up the last of their fuel and thrown the empty cans overboard. Now they could only drift at the mercy of the currents and the wind. When they went to sleep that night, they had only 11 coconuts left. Their sleep was fitful and uncomfortable. They fell asleep wet from the spray that constantly came into the boat through the low sides. The wind picked up. Etwini, who had lost his shirt on the first night, suffered particularly from the cold. In the morning, there was still nothing but water around them. No lifeboats, no planes. Etwini was the first to voice what all three were beginning to think. They should have been found by now. Sami and Philo reacted with nervous laughter, trying to hide their growing anxiety. Despite the storm forecasts, not a drop of rain had fallen during the entire journey. Their only source of calories was a few coconuts. That day, everyone drank and ate too, but it did not quench their thirst or hunger. By the 5th day, the approximate time when people usually found those lost at sea, Samu, Philo, and Etwini finally admitted to each other that they wanted to go home. On the 6th day, they realized the magnitude of their mistake. They had eaten all the coconuts, and thirst gripped their throats like a merciless hand. Thoughts of drinking seawater began to occur to them more and more often. Philo tried to warn his companions, knowing that salt water would only increase dehydration. But the next morning, Samu resolutely scooped up some seawater in a ceramic cup and began to drink it slowly. Soon the others could no longer resist their thirst. Despite understanding the danger, Etwini and Philo followed Samu's example. In desperation, all three drank the salty water, knowing full well that it would only make their situation worse. The scorching sun mercilessly burned their skin, causing severe burns. Their entire bodies were covered with a painfully itchy rash. The teenagers had dark skin, but even that could not protect them from the tropical sun. They gradually lost strength, and their hopes for rescue faded with each sunrise and sunset. Finally, after more than a week of drifting, the long-awaited rain came. For the first time, the teenagers used the green tarpaulin, spreading it out to collect fresh water. It was the first glimmer of hope in many days. Sama, Philo, and Etwini saw many fish around them. The shadow of the drifting boat created a kind of artificial reef that attracted small fish, which in turn attracted larger predators. Seabirds constantly circled above them, diving for fish during the day and resting on the water at night. All the food they needed was in plain sight, but out of reach because of a reckless decision at the beginning of their journey. Etwini tried to catch fish with his bare hands, simply holding them in the water over the side of the boat. He could feel the fish moving near his fingers, but he couldn't grab them. By pure chance, they managed to catch a few fish, only 4 in the entire journey. The waves sometimes threw fish right into the boat. The low sides, which had been the main disadvantage in a storm, now became an unexpected advantage. Seawater constantly splashed inside, sometimes bringing live food with it. After about 2 weeks of drifting, a storm hit them. It lasted almost 3 days. Rain poured down like a bucket, and the boat filled with water faster than they could bail it out. The teenagers were shivering violently from the cold. To keep warm, they huddled together under the tarpaulin, sitting with their legs crossed. From the outside, their small boat looked like a haystack in the middle of a raging ocean. It was warm under the tarpaulin, so despite the danger of sinking, they sat there all day, huddled together, while the rain drummed and the wind raged outside. At that moment, they felt like a united team, dependent on each other, in a tiny boat in the middle of an endless sea. A few nights after the storm, they spotted a ship, a large vessel with a deck outlined by orange lights. It was the first ship they had seen since leaving Tokelau. It was difficult to determine how far away it was. They tried to use the tarpaulin as a sail to get closer, but their weakened bodies quickly grew tired of this exhausting task. Samo, who had always been the leader, suggested taking a risk and trying to swim to the ship. But the question of who should go sparked a heated debate. Samu believed that as the strongest among them, he should go alone. Philo insisted that it would be safer to go together. That way, they would have a better chance of at least one of them making it and bringing back help. Etwini, still weakened after weeks of silence, wavered between the fear of being left alone in the boat and the fear of drowning in the dark ocean. Exhausted by hunger and thirst, they argued as the orange light slowly receded into the horizon. Each put forward arguments, but no one was ready to make a final decision. Samu rose several times, as if about to jump, but then sank back down onto the bench. Phil prayed, looking for a sign of what to do. Their emaciated bodies and stress-ridden minds were incapable of decisive action. When the last orange light disappeared into the darkness, a heavy silence fell over the boat. The realization of the missed opportunity was bitter. The silence was replaced by mutual recriminations. Sam blamed Philo for indecision. Philo accused Sam of selfishness, and both reproached Etwini for passivity. But these outbursts of anger quickly faded. They didn't even have the strength to argue. All that remained was the oppressive reality. They had missed what was possibly their only chance of salvation. Now all they could do was sit in their boat and wait. Shortly after this episode, Etwini broke down psychologically. He stopped talking, curled up in the bow of the boat, and lay there for days on end. This state continued for many days. Plunged into a deep depression, he often thought about suicide. The teenager's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. Their bodies, once strong and healthy, were now emaciated shells. Their skin was covered with painful burns and rashes that intensified their suffering. Every movement required incredible effort, and constant dehydration and hunger robbed them of their last reserves of strength. One afternoon, while Etwini continued his silent seclusion in the bow of the boat, a gray seagull, one of those that constantly circled around the drifting boat, landed right on the side. It happened so unexpectedly that the teenagers froze, afraid to scare away the unexpected guest. Their emaciated bodies barely moved, and their eyes, clouded by hunger and dehydration, were fixed on the bird as if it were a vision from another world. For the teenagers, this bird was the first living creature they had seen in weeks, apart from a few fish and each other. It represented the freedom they had lost and the life they were now desperately clinging to. A few days later, after a heavy downpour, when the tarpaulin sagged under the weight of the rainwater that had collected, another bird flew in. It landed on the edge of the boat and began to drink. Sama, who had once been the strongest of the three but could now barely move, gathered his last strength. Slowly and cautiously, he approached the bird. With one lightning-fast movement, he managed to grab it by the neck before it could take flight. Weak from exhaustion, the teenagers gathered around this unexpected gift from fate. Their trembling hands hastily plucked the feathers, while Philo whispered a prayer of thanks. They divided the carcass into 3 equal parts and tried to eat it raw. Despite their agonizing hunger, the taste of raw meat was so disgusting that even their stomachs, ready to accept anything, protested. Then they laid the remains of the meat on the sun-warmed surface of the boat. The scorching rays that had been their enemies for weeks now became their allies, slowly drying the meat to a state where it could be eaten. The process took almost the entire day, and the teenagers kept their eyes on their precious booty, afraid that a random wave would wash it overboard. The taste of sun-dried meat was incomparably better than raw meat. They chewed every tiny piece slowly, forcing themselves not to swallow right away, prolonging the pleasure of their first real meal in many days. This meager lunch awakened a long-forgotten feeling of fullness in them. This day was a turning point for Etwini. The bird seemed to bring him back to life. He broke his long silence and began to communicate with his companions again. It was a moment of unity amid endless trials. The relief brought by a few pieces of meat did not last long. It only awakened their stomachs, dormant from hunger, causing them to rumble with digestive juices. but there was nothing else to eat. Soon they felt even hungrier than before. During moments of relative calm, Samu and Philo would occasionally jump into the water to cool off. Ewan, however, felt too weak to leave the boat. During one such swim, Philo let go of the boat. The current was strong and he began to drift away. He was too weak to catch up with the boat on his own. At that moment, Samu performed an act of incredible heroism. Holding on to the boat with one hand, he swam with the other, exerting superhuman effort in his exhausted state. He managed to reach Philo and grab his arm. Then he helped pull his friend back into the boat. After that incident, no one dared to swim. The risk of being swept away by the current was too great. By this point, they were on the verge of life and death, driven to the brink by hunger and despair. In their extreme desperation, they ate their own hair and pieces of their fingernails, anything that could give them even the slightest sensation of food. They were on the verge of death. The rash on Phil's skin reached a point of unbearable pain. At night, he suddenly felt what can only be described as an electric shock throughout his body. He began to scream, begging for help and relief from the pain. They lay at the bottom of the boat in an extremely weakened state, covered with tarpaulin, on the verge of death. More than 50 days had passed since they left Atafu. The teenagers' bodies had exhausted all their resources, their muscle tissue was breaking down, and their consciousness was beginning to cloud over. They stopped bailing water, stopped talking, stopped waiting. And then Samu rose for a moment to see if rain clouds were coming, their last source of fresh water. What he saw changed everything. The silhouette of a large ship was visible on the horizon. Summoning his last ounce of strength, he raised his arm and began waving, signaling to his companions that he could see the ship. His voice was filled with an emotion they had long forgotten: hope. Right in front of them was the fishing vessel, San Nikunau. The teenagers began to wave weakly, but their exhausted bodies were capable of only minimal movement. At that moment, they did not know if they would be noticed. The ship was not changing course and seemed likely to pass by. From the upper deck of the ship, First Mate Ty Fredrickson noticed a strange object in the water. Raising his binoculars, he saw a small boat with 3 figures. He shouted into a megaphone, asking if they needed help. The teenagers responded with an energetic yes, putting all their remaining strength into the cry. It was the moment when 51 days of nightmare came to an end. The ship lowered a small lifeboat. Fredrickson took a photo before pulling the teenagers aboard. This image would later shock the world. 3 naked, emaciated teenagers looking up at their savior. Their bodies, once strong and healthy, had become skeletons covered in skin with burns and rashes. The crew helped them up, carefully carrying their exhausted bodies. On the deck of the ship, they sat in a daze, barely aware of what was happening. The smell of food from the galley seemed unreal after weeks of starvation. Fredrickson gave them an electrolyte drink and some bread, fearing that their stomachs would not be able to handle heavier food. Etwini tried an apple, but immediately threw up into a bowl in the kitchen. They took showers and were given clothes by the crew. Their boat was also hoisted aboard to be returned to Toklau. That night, all 3 slept in the same bed in Fredrickson's cabin, their first time in a real bed in almost 2 months. They had drifted about 900 miles from Atafu and were found in a deserted part of the Pacific Ocean, where even fishing boats rarely venture. During that time, they had already been mourned as dead in their home atoll. Search operations had long since ceased, and memorial services had been held in the church. For 51 days, the teenagers struggled with relentless trials, the merciless sun and cold nights, thirst and hunger, despair and fear. They argued with each other, lost hope, withdrew into themselves, but each time found the strength to continue the fight, and against all odds, they won. On November 26, 2010, the teenagers were taken to Colonial War Memorial Hospital in the Fijian capital. Doctors diagnosed extreme dehydration, fungal infections, second-degree burns, anemia, rapid heartbeat, and significant muscle loss. Tokelau's director of health, Lean Pierce, later said that they probably would not have survived another week. The teenagers spent several days in the hospital, then flew to Samoa, where they stayed with a Tokelauan family to rest and recover. Samoa, who had never left Tokelau before, contracted chickenpox, which added complications to his already serious condition. On Atafu, the news of the teenagers' rescue caused an incredible wave of happiness. Samu was the first to call home. He contacted his grandmother to tell her about the miraculous rescue. Tanu Philo, the father of one of the teenagers, described how the entire village shouted and cheered when they heard the incredible news. Aunt Fiki, who had always believed that the boys were alive, saw their rescue as confirmation of her faith. Finally, after Christmas 2010, the teenagers were able to return to their native Atafu. They were welcomed as heroes, with a big celebration and traditional dances. Samo gave a speech in which he apologized for his actions and thanked everyone for their support. It was a touching reunion with families who had almost come to terms with the idea that they were dead. The teenagers' physical recovery was gradual. Their bodies slowly gained weight and their burns and infections healed, but the psychological scars proved to be deeper. Philo, Samu, and Etwini now looked at their native island in a completely different light. The place that had once seemed like a prison to them was now a refuge they had desperately sought while adrift. However, something had changed in their perception. Within 2 months of their return, all three left Atafu. Philo and Samu left with their families for Australia, while Etwini moved with his relatives to Hawaii. They were looking for a new start in places where they weren't surrounded by the ocean on all sides, where they didn't have to see the water that had almost become their grave every day. The story of 3 teenagers from Tokelau is a reminder of how fragile human life is in the face of the elements, but also of the incredible ability of humans to survive in the most extreme conditions. Their 51-day odyssey across the Pacific Ocean turned from an impulsive teenage decision into an epic struggle for survival that brought out both the worst and the best in people. None of them know if they will ever return to Atafu. Their spontaneous journey, which began as a search for adventure and freedom, led to an unexpected outcome. They did indeed leave their prison island, but at a price that none of them were prepared to pay. The ocean remains the same, beautiful and unforgiving. The Tokelau atolls still rise above the water like fragile islands of life. And the story of Samu, Philo, and Etwini has become part of local folklore, a warning to young people and a reminder that true freedom is not always found where we look for it. These 3 teenagers survived against all odds, spending 51 days in the open ocean in a fragile boat. Their story makes us wonder, what is it inside us that allows us to fight when our minds tell us that all is lost? Where is the line beyond which survival instinct overcomes logic and fear? Imagine yourself in their place. What would you do if you found yourself in the middle of the endless ocean with no hope of rescue? Would you be able to decide to drink seawater, knowing that it would only hasten your death? Or would you give up food so that your companion could live one more day? If you liked this story, support the channel. Like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories about the most incredible trials of the human spirit. Your support helps us create content about those who challenge the impossible. Take care and see you in the next episodes.